Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. Ready to get into some more fascinating stuff with me today?
Always.
Well, today we are going to be tackling something pretty heavy, international terrorism.
Yeah.
And you sent over some excerpts from Noam Chomsky's book, Pirates and Emperors. I gotta say, this book is pretty intense.
It's definitely thought-provoking.
Yeah, it really is. So, right off the bat, Chomsky kind of hits us with this analogy about a pirate and an emperor.
Right.
And, the pirate's there, he's been caught red-handed stealing, but he basically says, hey, look, I'm just a small-time thief compared to the emperor who's out there conquering entire nations.
Yeah.
It's a really powerful image, and it kind of sets the stage for, I think, his whole argument about terrorism.
It really does. That analogy is central to Chomsky's analysis because it highlights the hypocrisy he sees in how we define terrorism. He's basically arguing that the label is often applied inconsistently, and powerful nations like the United States and its allies often get a free pass for actions that would be condemned if they were carried out by others.
So it's not just about the act itself, but who's committing it. That seems like a pretty controversial claim.
It is controversial, but Chomsky backs it up with a lot of historical examples. One that he talks about is the U.S. bombing of Tripoli and Benghazi in 1985. Officially, this was retaliation against Libyan-sponsored terrorism. But Chomsky argues that the evidence was really flimsy, and the attack basically served to bolster the image of Gaddafi as like a villain while solidifying U.S. dominance in the region.
Okay, so how does that tie back to the pirate and the emperor?
Well, who has the overwhelming power in that situation? Who's dictating the terms? Chomsky would argue that the U.S. is acting more like the emperor, using its might to impose its will.
Right.
While Libya, with its much more limited resources, is cast in the role of the pirate, even if its actions were far less destructive.
It really makes you wonder how many other conflicts are viewed through that same kind of distorted lens.
Yeah, and that's Chomsky's point. He goes on to examine other examples like Israel's bombing of Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. These actions resulted in a lot of civilian casualties, but they rarely get labeled as terrorism in the mainstream media.
Yeah, so it's like there's this double standard at play.
Exactly. And Chomsky argues that the selective use of the terrorism label is a way for powerful nations to control the narrative and justify their own actions, even when those actions result in, violence and suffering.
So he's not just critiquing specific events, but like exposing a deeper pattern of behavior.
Exactly. And that's where his analysis of the Reagan administration's war on terror in the 1980s becomes really relevant. Chomsky argues that the U.S. support for death squads in El Salvador and the Contra War against Nicaragua had devastating consequences for these countries. It led to widespread human rights abuses and, mass killings.
And those were both incredibly brutal conflicts. But how does he connect them to the broader issue of terrorism?
Well, Chomsky's argument is that by supporting these groups, even indirectly, the U.S. was engaging in a form of state-sponsored terrorism. These actions were all aimed at destabilizing governments that the U.S. considered hostile to its interests, even if it meant propping up these brutal regimes and turning a blind eye to atrocities.
That's a pretty bold claim. Isn't that a bit of a stretch?
Well, he uses this incident where the U.S. backed South Africa's attack on Russian ships in Angola. This attack was carried out using Israeli-made missiles, and it was hardly a secret.
Right.
But it didn't provoke the kind of outrage that you might expect if, say, hypothetically, Libya had attacked U.S. ships.
So he's saying that the reaction, or in this case, the lack of reaction, is part of the problem.
Yeah, Chomsky argues that this just highlights the hypocrisy in how we define and respond to terrorism. It's not just about the act itself, but who is committing it and what political agenda it serves.
Okay, so we're starting to see how Chomsky connects these seemingly separate events to paint this bigger picture. But how does he explain why this keeps happening? Why do we as a society just seem to accept these double standards?
Well, that's where his concept of the manufacture of consent comes in. Chomsky argues that the media and political rhetoric are often used to shape public perception.
Right.
And to justify U.S. foreign policy actions, even when those actions might be considered morally questionable.
So it's not necessarily about outright lies, but about how information is presented and what gets emphasized or conveniently left out.
Exactly. And he gives examples like the selective reporting and, omission of crucial facts about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Oftentimes, the media portrays Israel as the victim and the Palestinians as the aggressors,
right,
even though both sides have legitimate grievances and have suffered greatly.
Yeah, it's like he's saying that we need to be much more critical consumers of information, especially when it comes to these complex global conflicts. But how do we even begin to do that?
That's something I think we'll be able to unpack a little bit further as we dive deeper into Chomsky's analysis.
Okay.
But for now, I think the key takeaway is to be aware of how power dynamics shape the narratives that we're presented with, to ask ourselves, who benefits from this story? Whose voices are being silenced? And what are the alternative perspectives that we might be missing?
That's a lot to unpack, but I have to admit it's already making me think about these issues in a whole new way. So before I move on, I want to ask you, what stands out to you so far in Chomsky's analysis? What's really resonating with you?
I think for me, it's the way he connects the dots between these seemingly separate events. He reveals these underlying patterns of power that really shape our understanding of terrorism. It's a reminder that these conflicts don't exist in a vacuum. They're part of this larger system that often prioritizes the interests of the powerful at the expense of the, less fortunate.
It's a sobering thought, but I think it's also incredibly important to acknowledge these dynamics if we ever hope to create a more just and peaceful world. So we've laid some groundwork here with Chomsky's pirate and emperor analogy. We've explored some key examples of how he sees this dynamic playing out in the real world.
Definitely.
But there's still so much more to uncover.
There is. In part 2, we'll delve even deeper into his critiques of the U.S. war on terror, particularly in the context of the post-9/11 world.
So stay tuned, folks. We're just getting started on this deep dive into Noam Chomsky's thought-provoking analysis of international terrorism. Okay, so we're back and ready to keep going on this deep dive into Noam Chomsky's Pirates and Emperors.
Yeah.
We've been talking about his critique of how power kind of shapes our perception of terrorism
Right.
and often leads to these double standards and justifications for violence by powerful nations. We left off talking about his concept of manufacturing consent, and I'm curious to hear more about how that plays out in the post-9/11 world.
Well, Chomsky argues that the war on terror that came after 9/11 became a prime example of how powerful nations, and especially the United States, can manipulate public opinion to support their own agendas, even when those agendas might be, questionable or even counterproductive.
So he's not denying the horror of 9/11, but he's questioning how those attacks were then used to justify certain actions.
Exactly. He's not diminishing the tragedy of 9/11,
Yeah.
but he critiques how the Bush administration used the fear and outrage that was generated by those attacks to launch what they called the global war on terror, which he argues was already being planned before the attacks even happened.
Right. And he's particularly critical of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan.
Right.
Right.
He sees it as a classic case of the emperor, kind of flexing its muscles. He argues that the invasion, while it was framed as a necessary response to 9/11,
Right.
was more about projecting U.S. power in this strategically important region and, securing access to resources.
That's a pretty bold claim. What evidence does he present to support that view?
Well, Chomsky points to the fact that the Bush administration had already been considering military action in Afghanistan before 9/11. They were citing concerns about the Taliban harboring al-Qaeda.
Okay.
But Chomsky's argument is that those concerns were often exaggerated and that the U.S. had its own strategic interests in the region.
Okay.
Things like, oil pipelines and geopolitical influence.
So in Chomsky's view, 9/11 provided a convenient pretext for an invasion that was already in the works.
That's his argument. And he's especially critical of the humanitarian cost of that invasion and the long-term instability that it created in Afghanistan. He reminds us that, millions of Afghan people were already suffering under Taliban rule.
Right.
And that the bombing campaign and subsequent war just made their plight so much worse.
So even if you accept the premise that the U.S. did have legitimate security concerns, he's saying that the execution of the war on terror was deeply flawed and ultimately counterproductive.
That's the core of his argument. And he goes beyond just criticizing U.S. military actions. He also highlights the hypocrisy of labeling certain groups as terrorists while ignoring or even supporting similar groups that align with U.S. interests.
So this reminds me of the pirate and emperor analogy again. It's like the emperor needs to decide who's a pirate based on his own kind of arbitrary definition.
That's a great connection.
Yeah.
Chomsky would definitely agree with that. He argues that the U.S. has a long history of supporting groups that engage in violence and terror when it suits their strategic goals.
Can you give me like a specific example of what he's talking about?
Sure. He points to the U.S. support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan during the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s.
Okay.
These are the same groups that later gave rise to al-Qaeda and the Taliban. At the time, they were seen as, freedom fighters opposing Soviet aggression.
Right.
But Chomsky argues that the U.S. was knowingly supporting groups that use these brutal tactics and, espoused extremist ideologies.
So he's saying that we can't just look at these conflicts in isolation, right? We have to consider the historical context and the role that powerful nations have played in shaping these dynamics.
That's exactly right. And his argument is that the selective use of the terrorism label is just a way for powerful nations to control the narrative.
Okay.
And justify their own actions, even when those actions result in, violence and suffering.
But wouldn't you say there's a difference between supporting a group that's fighting against, a foreign power and directly engaging in terrorism yourself?
That's a fair point, and it is a really complex issue.
Yeah.
But Chomsky's argument is that the lines are often very blurred, especially when you consider the long-term consequences of those actions.
So it's not just about, the immediate act, but about the ripple effects that could fuel future conflict and instability.
Right. And he argues that this is especially true in the Middle East, where U.S. policies have often, created more problems than they've solved.
And he's a pretty vocal critic of the U.S.'s close relationship with Israel, isn't he?
Yes. Chomsky is very critical of U.S. support for Israel.
Okay.
And particularly its policies towards the Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
He argues that the U.S. has consistently turned a blind eye to Israeli human rights violations and, their expansion of settlements in the occupied territories.
Right.
Actions that he sees as fueling Palestinian resentment and undermining the possibility of a peaceful resolution.
And that's obviously a very sensitive and controversial issue. How does he address the argument that Israel has a right to defend itself against terrorism?
Well, Chomsky acknowledges that Israel does face legitimate security concerns.
Sure.
But he argues that their response has often been disproportionate and counterproductive.
Okay.
He points to the blockade of Gaza, the demolition of Palestinian homes, and the targeted killings of suspected militants as examples of policies that he sees as violating international law and perpetuating this cycle of violence.
So he's not just saying that, Israel is the bad guy in this scenario. He's trying to present a more nuanced view of the conflict, one that acknowledges the complexities and the suffering on both sides.
Exactly. Chomsky argues that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a tragedy for both peoples.
Yeah.
And that the U.S., by so blindly supporting Israel, has become complicit in perpetuating that tragedy.
Okay, so we've talked about how Chomsky views the war on terror as this tool of empire.
Right.
How he sees these double standards and the application of the terrorism label.
Yeah.
And how he critiques U.S. policy in the Middle East. But what's the takeaway for us? What does he want us to do with all this information?
Well, I don't think Chomsky is just trying to point fingers or assign blame. He's trying to raise awareness about how power operates in the world and how that shapes our understanding of complex issues like terrorism. He wants us to be more critical consumers of information.
Yeah.
Question the narratives that are presented to us and demand more from our leaders.
He's calling for a more informed and engaged citizenry, one that's willing to challenge the status quo and demand a more just and peaceful world. It's a tall order, but it's also pretty inspiring.
And that's what makes Chomsky such a compelling figure. Yeah. He doesn't sugarcoat anything or offer easy solutions.
Yeah.
But he does offer a way of seeing the world that can be challenging, but also empowering.
We've covered a lot of ground in this part, from the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But, Chomsky's analysis goes even deeper than that.
Yeah, in our final part, we'll explore some of his ideas about how we can move beyond just the war on terror framework and work towards creating a more just and peaceful world.
So stay with us as we continue this deep dive into Noam Chomsky's Pirates and Emperors. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Chomsky's Pirates and Emperors.
Yeah.
We spent this whole deep dive exploring this idea of, how Chomsky uses that pirate and emperor analogy to highlight the hypocrisy in how we define terrorism and how those power dynamics so often lead to these double standards and the justification of violence by, powerful nations.
Right.
We've also delved into some of his critiques of the U.S. war on terror and its impact on, the Middle East.
Yeah.
But now I want to know, what does he actually propose we do about all this? What's the alternative to this seemingly endless cycle of violence?
Well, that's the big question.
Yeah.
And Chomsky doesn't really offer any, simple solutions.
Right.
Instead, he wants us to kind of shift our entire framework for how we understand and address terrorism.
Okay.
He argues that current war on terror model,
right,
with all the emphasis on military solutions and the demonization of enemies, is not only ineffective, but it's actually counterproductive.
So if the current approach isn't working, what does he suggest we do?
Well, he thinks the first step is to move beyond these kind of simplistic narratives that we often use to, make our foreign policy decisions.
Yeah.
He challenges us to really question the assumptions that we've been taught
Yeah.
about who are the good guys, who are the bad guys,
Right.
and just acknowledge the complexities of these conflicts.
Yeah. It seems like he talks a lot about the need for a more nuanced understanding of history
Exactly.
and the role that powerful nations have played in, actually creating the conditions that lead to terrorism.
That's exactly right.
Mm.
He says we can't really address terrorism effectively unless we understand those root causes.
Yeah.
And those root causes, they often lie in the injustices and the inequalities
Yeah.
that have been created and perpetuated by the very same powers that claim to be fighting terrorism.
So it's not just about going after individual terrorists or groups, but about addressing those underlying political and economic systems that create the conditions for extremism to take root.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And he argues that this requires a really fundamental shift in our foreign policy priorities.
Okay.
Instead of focusing on military interventions and regime change, he believes that we should be investing in things like diplomacy, conflict resolution, promoting human rights and economic justice around the world.
He's basically saying that we can't bomb our way to peace.
Exactly. He argues that violence often begets more violence, and that the way to achieve true security is by addressing those root causes of conflict, not just the symptoms.
But isn't that a little idealistic? The world is a complex and often dangerous place. I mean, surely there are times when military force is actually necessary.
Well, Chomsky doesn't rule out the use of force entirely,
Okay.
but he believes that it should be a last resort, never the first option. And he argues that even when force is used, it should be done in a way that minimizes, civilian casualties and adheres to international law.
It sounds like he's a strong advocate for international law and diplomacy as a way to, resolve conflicts peacefully.
Absolutely. He thinks international institutions, while they're not perfect,
Right.
do provide a framework for holding those powerful nations accountable
Okay.
and for promoting cooperation. And he really sees diplomacy as the most effective way to address that complex web of interests and grievances that often underlie these conflicts.
But let's be realistic. Diplomacy can be a really slow and frustrating process, and it doesn't always work, right?
That's true. But Chomsky argues that we have to at least be willing to invest in that long game. Building trust and finding that common ground takes time and effort.
Right.
But it's ultimately a lot more sustainable than relying on military force, which often creates more problems than it solves.
This kind of brings us back to his whole concept of, manufacturing consent.
Right.
He argues that if we want to change our foreign policy, we need to change the narrative.
Exactly. He believes that the media plays a huge role in shaping public opinion.
Right.
And that we need to be more critical of the information that we're being fed. He encourages us to, seek out alternative perspectives, question the official line,
Right.
and hold our leaders accountable for their actions.
So it's not about just blindly accepting what we're told, but about engaging in critical thinking and demanding transparency.
Exactly. And Chomsky believes that this kind of informed and engaged citizenry is essential for creating a more just and peaceful world.
Okay.
He sees hope in the growing number of people that are challenging the status quo, demanding change, and working to create a better future.
So while he's a pretty sharp critic of the current system, he's not a complete pessimist, right? He believes that change is possible, but it requires all of us to be, active and engaged citizens.
Exactly. And he sees that responsibility for creating that change, not just with our leaders, but with every single one of us.
It's a powerful message, and it definitely leaves us with a lot to think about. As we wrap up this deep dive into Pirates and Emperors, I'm curious, what's your biggest takeaway from Chomsky's work? What's the one thing you really want our listeners to remember?
I think for me, the biggest takeaway is just the importance of questioning everything. Don't take anything at face value, especially when it comes to these issues of war and peace.
Yeah.
Do your own research. Seek out those diverse perspectives and challenge the narratives that are being used to justify violence and oppression.
It's about being an active participant in shaping the world we want to live in, not just, passively observing it.
Absolutely. And that's something that really resonates deeply with me.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Noam Chomsky's Pirates and Emperors.
Yeah.
It's been a really, challenging and thought-provoking journey.
It has.
And we've only just scratched the surface of this complex and important work. We hope this deep dive has given you some new insights and perspectives to kind of consider as you continue to, navigate the complexities of the world around us.
Definitely. And as Chomsky reminds us, the power to create a more just and peaceful world ultimately rests with each of us.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.